Hi, everyone. Hi, I'm Derek.
I'm Terrell.
And welcome to Talk and Play 03. We're talking about race and visibility in a game called Mafia III. Thanks for joining us. We're going to be recording some of this, so thank you for agreeing to be here and help us out and support and participate. Yeah, this is our third Talk and Play event, and we're really excited to sort of delve into some new topics. But before we get started, I just want to sort of lay out a roadmap for the evening. So just to let you guys know what we're going to be doing. We're going to sort of try and set up Mafia 3 a little bit before you set up the theme, give you a little bit of a framework to work with for thinking about the gameplay that we're going to have later. So that'll include talking about what Talk and Play is. We'll do a little introduction to the series and also this specific title. And we're also going to be introducing today's theme and questions, this idea of race and visibility. Followed by some gameplay, about 30 minutes, then we'll do a little bit of small group discussion, and then some bigger open group discussion, free discussion. So without any further ado, just as a quick reminder, some of you who've been here before have heard the spiel before, but I'll just give it again really quick. Talk and Play is sort of a thing that we started this year in partnership with a lot of different people across campus, but we're hosting it here at the Center for Digital Humanities, and the goals are really to provide time and provide a time and a place for sort of social and critical play. We're also hoping to connect people across campus who are interested in games. A lot of people, game designers, people who play games, people who are interested in critiquing them and discussing them, all sorts of ways. So that's one of the primary goals of Talk and Play. We were inspired actually by an undergraduate student club. Joe was a big leader of that for a while. It's called VSIMS, Vanderbilt Students of Interactive Media Studies. They had this really cool structure where they would come and they would just do their own presentations and just because they wanted to, and they wanted to talk with people about games and dig deeper with them. And it was so cool. I thought we should make that happen more often. It's also sort of inspired by the Scholars at Play podcast I do with Terrell and also with Kyle, who's in the back. Kyle, give a little yelp.
What up?
So yeah, it's definitely inspired by a lot of different things, but those are some of the backgrounds. And then just some values, because I think there's a million events, and sometimes it helps to say what the point of a thing is. It's this balance between something that I'm provisionally calling critique and curiosity. So I think it's really important to here at the Academy, we do a lot of critical work, thinking about what kinds of ideas a game sort of puts forth about politics and society and ethics and all sorts of things. So I think that's a really important thing that we can do here. We also want to be sort of open to those moments and curious about different objects in those moments when they sort of do something really important, even if they're kind of imperfect. So that's sort of the key thing about critique and curiosity. We're also committed to sort of diversity, inclusivity, and anti-oppression. This sort of practically speaking in sort of practices, this just means being respectful to everybody else and not using language that makes people feel uncomfortable, and just sort of being patient and generous with your comments and your questions and sharing the conversation with everybody. And also we really want to sort of foster this scholarly approach to play, games, and game culture. I think this is not, the games are in the world, they're important, people engage with them a lot. I don't think we even have to make the argument for that anymore. And they're also in the university. A lot of scholars in the 90s and the 2000s did a lot of work to bring games into the university, and we can build on that now. And I think that's really awesome. And I also just think that the scholarly, engaging with the scholarly approach to games is not only valuable inside the university, but there are lots of people who are both game designers, game players, or just people who are interested in games that are engaging with and creating different forms of critique and different forms of engagement with games and digging deep on them, and that we as scholars and people who have talked this through in scholarly terms have a chance to sort of strengthen those debates and really refine the terms and stuff like that. So that's my pitch for Talk and Play. Terrell is going to talk a little bit about the Mafia series.
Hello. So, how many of you have heard of the Mafia series before? Okay. Few hands. Has anybody played the Mafia? Any of the Mafia games? None? Okay.
Kyle has.
Kyle, of course, in the back.
Yeah.
So the first Mafia game came out in August of 2002. And one of the reasons that few people may know about it is because a game with very similar themes came out a few months later, in October of 2002, called Grand Theft Auto Vice City.
Yeah.
Now, both of those games kind of fit into this larger genre of games that are picking up on a few movies with certain themes. Goodfellas, The Godfather, Scarface, all of them sort of picking up on the sort of mafia, the sort of mob mentality, mob theme, if you will. So there's an individual who begins with very little at the start, but over time, through doing missions and building up various reputation, skills, money, resources, et cetera, you sort of try and achieve that dream of being the top gangster of your organization, so to speak. The characters sort of start from that sort of base level and then move up from there. In 2010, Mafia II was released, and that took place in a place called Empire Bay, which is meant to represent New York City. And 2 years ago, 2016 now, Mafia III was released, focusing on New Bordeaux, which is sort of a recreation of New Orleans. That takes place in 1968 with a very sort of racially charged and a lot of different various national and sort of global events going on that inform it.
And as you can see, this is just an infographic just to show you who's developing these games on the last slide. The publisher has been 2K Games for a while, but a lot of different studios have worked on the Mafia series. The most recent one, of course, for us is Hangar 13. And I want to talk a little bit about Mafia 3 and how that sort of came about. Yeah, did you have a question, Alyssa? Of course.
Okay, when you say, can you go back?
Yeah, sure.
When you say different developers,
yes.
I just don't know what.
That's totally fine. Okay, so publishers, let me be generous.
Yeah, is it like a studio, or is it like that's the person who crafts the game players?
Yeah. So like a publisher will provide like financial support for the most part. That would be for marketing and like a lot of other kind of like business type stuff. Whereas these developers, like a really broad word, a developer could be a person or like a whole ton of people. And like, so you could have like a studio like Hangar 13, I think they call themselves a studio. But like the developer is the person who's really building the game. They're thinking about the narrative. They're thinking about how to make the game feel fun or like feel responsive or how they can create an engaging and interesting game, basically. Okay. So that's the role. That's a great question. The developers really sort of are the ones building the game with tools, and the publishers sort of supplying a lot of other kinds of support.
Awesome.
Great question. So that takes us to Hangar 13, and so they're founded really in 2014 kind of to make this game. Mafia 3 is their first game, and they have studios in California and the Czech Republic. And the game, Mafia 3, was released in October 7, 2016. Terrell already said that. And it's sort of like open world. So if you know anything about Grand Theft Auto, it's this sort of go anywhere, do anything kind of a thing. But I would suggest that like Mafia 3 does a lot of really twists that in a lot of interesting ways. And like really kind of, the question of whether or not it's an open world game is a good one for us to talk about later. This is also a good moment to just quickly mention that Hangar 13 recently had a lot of layoffs. 2K did a lot of layoffs at Hangar 13, and we just want to like say, hey guys, like we hope everyone lands on their feet and that they're doing okay, and that they find other work that they find really satisfying. Because I don't know, I think this is an amazing thing to have in your resume. It's a fantastic game. Cool. Real quick, I'm going to recap the story with as few spoilers as possible. We're not going to start very far into the game, and we're not going to do a lot of cinematic type stuff. But as Terrell said, set in 1968, definitely in the American South, but in this fake New Orleans, basically New Bordeaux. The protagonist is Lincoln Clay, and he is, he's got a sort of interesting backstory. He's like, abandoned by his parents, and he's got possibly like a mixed race background, and he's taken in by this sort of this figure, Sammy Robinson, who is in charge of the black mafia or the black mob. In this game, like everything is a mafia or a mob. There's the Dixie mafia, and then there's the Italian mafia, and there's the Irish mob or whatever. That's just like a convention of the series. So he's taken by Sammy Robinson, and he then goes to Vietnam after working for him, and he gets trained in guerrilla warfare and psychological warfare, and he becomes like a really powerful soldier, basically, and comes back to New Bordeaux, basically just to say goodbye as a vet. Like he's gonna go make a new life for himself, and I think California is like the general destination. But then gets sucked in, right? He gets sucked in back into some problems that are happening. So Sal Marcano is the guy in the bottom right there. He is the sort of like lead, crime boss in New Bordeaux. Everyone sort of pays up to him, and bad things happen, and I don't want to spoil it, but things unfold such that Lincoln swears to just totally take down Sal Marcano and his entire operation, and you spend most of the game doing that. So we're going to move into our sort of topic and sort of theme for the evening, thinking about race and visibility in Mafia III. And I want to just start with a clip from about 1/3 of the way into the game, maybe a little bit earlier than that. It's a conversation between Sal Marcano, and you can see on the screen that's Georgie, his son. And they're talking about a casino that they want to build, and like they're trying to go legit and get out of the crime, get out of doing crime. Also, there's some slurs in this clip. I just want to let you guys know. We're not going to have any more. We might hear some during gameplay as well. Just let you know in advance.
You think sitting in that chair makes you special, huh? Somehow puts you above all the bullshit. But it's the opposite. All it does is paint a giant goddamn bullseye on your forehead. There's a price to be paid for all this, you understand? And I'm tired of paying it. Mainly, I'm worried I'm gonna get a phone call telling me you're dead in a gutter somewhere.
What do you expect me to do, huh? Work the front door? Glad hand folks, as they come on in, maybe give them a quick slap on the ass?
You run it with me. And here, after a few years, after I know everything's settled down, you'll take over. Find yourself a nice woman. Give me some fucking grandkids.
Sounds boring as fuck.
It's the only way, son. The world is changing. Used to be people knew their place. Now everybody's screaming about equality. And now they all deserve a slice of the pie. Niggers, micks, gooks, you name it. Our way of doing things won't work in a world like that.
Okay, so I play that short clip because I think it sets up a lot of the conflict on the side of Sal Marcano, where he really feels that the status quo, which is really predicated and like maybe probably founded on something that a scholar like George Yancey might call whiteness, that's under threat. And I want to turn over to Terrell to talk a little bit more about setting up our theme and some of the terms we want to address tonight.
So, as this cutscene demonstrates, it would be very useful, maybe even valuable, to look at this game from the perspective of what it does sort of in a cinematic frame. So thinking about moments like this and calling them movies and talking about most of the game's content from that perspective. What we want to do is a little bit different and think more about the sort of gameplay, or think about Mafia III as it was meant to be played, and all the tools that the developers have used to convey some of those messages and some of those thematics. So we're going to think about things visually, right? In terms of what the game offers in terms of a visual rhetoric and how the sights, the sounds, the way that it depicts people, the way it depicts locations, New Orleans, the ways that it uses various images of the time, iconography, all those sort of things to tell a certain type of story about a certain type of place and time, and to make us respond in the way that we play accordingly. Separately, there's the mechanics. Now, mechanics, whenever we're talking about games, is a very sort of term that people use in a lot of different ways, but I think what we can use, or way we can describe it in this instance, is mechanics refer to what the game offers you as the player as tools for approaching the problems presented within the game space, sort of the affordances of the play. So these are all things like how Lincoln controls, the way that the game communicates things to the player through UI, what's on the heads-up display, the various indicators. When you drive, for example, it shows you the rear view mirror. You can see that on the screen. What does that communicate? What type of realism or verisimilitude is being communicated there? What are the limitations, the possibilities open to the player? Essentially the verbs that you will do as a player. Well, some may just say you're twiddling your thumbs or pressing buttons on the screen, but no, you're doing things, right? And the game has a language through which it offers you to do those things. Now, all of that happening on the machine level, right? These are all things that the machine is processing. What happens when you press X? What happens when you press square and enter into a car? That then leads to the third level that we're talking about, which is sort of the affective experience of play. What does it mean to be a player engaging with those systems, manipulating them as such? What is the sense, the feeling of play as such, and what type of intensities are built in, and how do those go to generate emotions, and how do those possibilities there become how we process the meaning within the game space? So this is a very broad and general term, but we're thinking about how does the game shape our thoughts, and maybe it doesn't necessarily have an argument per se within those mechanics and within those affects, but it is the condition of possibility for us to create an argument about the game space and the time of play and the politics of the time. So for this discussion, we're using a book written by George Yancey called Black Bodies, White Gazes, and we're thinking about the role of race within American history, specifically with this idea of whiteness. Now, George Yancey defines whiteness or depicts whiteness in a way that's very consistent with much of critical race theory in a sort of binary sense. Whiteness is always in contradistinction or in distinction to non-whiteness, or more specifically, as George Yancey advances, blackness, right? So the black body, which is sort of the focus of the book, is something that is constituted, something that is set aside, something that's getting a very set of concrete meaning such that whiteness has coherence, such that whiteness makes sense. Now, it's very interesting. Earlier, we had that sort of conversation with Sal Marcano. And interestingly enough, we could use another critical race theorist, or really a literary scholar who's also a critical race theorist. I'm an English PhD student, so that's where my heart lies. Toni Morrison in her book, Playing in the Dark. And what she has done is gone through various American authors, F. Scott Fitzgerald, for example, and some of her analysis of, for example, The Great Gatsby would be spot on for that conversation. This sense that there is something that is true to American or European civilization that needs to be held and defended from all others. And the possibility of that being lost is because something out there presents a threat, and that threat comes from the black body. It's always positioned with a certain set of terms, always positioned as something that's dangerous, something violent, something catastrophic to our sense of order, and whiteness needs to be there to police it, to keep it with its respective position. Now that sets up, and those sets of antagonism sets up what she calls, or what Yancey and various other critical race theorists are calling the white gaze, right? So we're trying to think through what it is that the game is doing to situate that white gaze, not necessarily reaffirm it, but show how it operates at the level of play. And given that you are controlling a character with a racially coded black body, what does it mean to operate within the game space effectively and have to work in contrast or in struggle with the white gaze as it operates, not just as a sort of code, but as a code within the digital code of the game?
Absolutely, yeah. So with that, we're going to transition into a little bit of gameplay. We're going to start off, I'll probably start us off playing, but what we're going to do is take a few walking tours of New Bordeaux. And maybe we'll get into one fight. I don't know, we'll see if we have time for it. But while we're doing this, I want you to feel free to like chat and like go get more pizza and like talk with someone or take notes or whatever. But like, we're going to talk about some of these questions after we're done playing. And so just have these in mind, thinking about how does whiteness sort of constitute and assert itself in New Bordeaux? What does the black body look like in New Bordeaux? What elements of the game are sort of are informing our understandings of race? And what is this? Yancey had that good quote about like, as objects, black bodies are both like intensely both invisible and hyper visible. How do we sort of see that play out in the game? Would that change how we play it? So I'm gonna stop us here and like switch some things around. So we're gonna go for a walking tour of the Delray Hollow. Once I get outside. So I'm not getting accosted. Now you can see on the mini map there at the bottom right, there's a few red things here. Apparently those people don't like me. I don't know who they are. Oh, that's Dixie Mafia guys.
What happens if you go over there?
I would have to kill them. They would try to kill me.
You wouldn't have to? Is that really?
Well, let me show you.
Well, area's off limits. Get.
So now if you depart, they don't pursue you?
We scare you off.
They do want to kill me now. You can see the bottom right, it says searching above the map. That means they're sort of looking.
You left searching for you. You left,
yes.
But they're still all about getting after you.
Yep. Hop out, maybe walk around here, maybe. That'd be good. Also drive. It's good. That's pretty cool. I've never done that before. Nothing, not doing anything wrong. Just nothing to see here. Just walking. Hey,
What a lovely garden.
Yeah. Just enjoy the garden.
Is that a magnolia?
I think it is a magnolia. I'll finish this out and see if we can find the statue there. But
This seems like a cool guy.
Whoa! You did that right in front of a cop, I guess.
Sophia saw
I wanted you to punch somebody, not something.
You didn't specify.
Oh, man.
You just said to hit somebody, so I did.
Oh, no. Coming through.
Pardon. Quiet, you.
Oh, well, Adam's gonna get to do a little fighting because he's in an enemy area.
Mother of God.
This is a bad day.
Pretty
So,
cool.
Adam, what's happening?
So, this is happening.
Sorry. I know this wasn't your intent, Derek. I'm trying to get out of this situation.
This is
Why
why
did you run into the statue?
I mean, I did this on purpose because I wanted you to.
Because you said you thought I was gonna do it. What does that say about me?
No, I wanted to abdicate the control. So now you can just run towards that marker over there. You can also grab a car if you want.
Ooh, what up, car?
We'll lose our car.
This is exactly the kind of car I want.
Right trigger is going to go forward and left trigger will go backwards. And also function as the brake.
Oh my god, I get House of the Rising Sun,
Oh,
too?
we got to turn that off, sorry.
Oh, just...
Because if I upload this, then I don't want to take it down. You can stop somewhere here. It's good. And just sort of get out with square.
Just sort of get out.
Yeah, and then head to the left.
Okay.
Down the alley?
Straight ahead. Yep, and you're going to turn left at here. Turn left here. Oh, and hide, press X, press X, press X.
Ah!
Take off.
Okay, so,
You knew exactly what you were supposed to do.
Alright, so tap the up button on the D-pad.
Okay.
Press circle.
I'm so confused! I'm sorry! I'm so sorry! I don't know what's happening!
You got him, you got him, you got him! Yeah, you got him! Now go run towards him. Turn the camera. Oh no!
X, I'm so sorry! I'm so sorry!
It's okay. You're
That was
fine.
very overwhelming.
You're fine. It is a little intimidating to go into.
You did a great job. What am I doing right now?
Game is not like when I pause in the middle.
So I noticed like people in GTA used to do that too. They would dive in front of your car.
Oh, whoops. Oh, watch out! Okay. Oh, boy.
The cops are hitting you.
Well, so that's an example of what happens. It's not going to go well, because this car is bad. So, rear view mirror. We can see what happened to that cop car.
You got it, man. This car is gonna do it for you.
Oh no!
This is a terrible idea.
Oh boy! So you know.
She's called off.
As Espinosa says, the games are cyber texts that resist us when we're trying to get through them. So I think this is a great illustration of that. Okay, it's not here. God damn. Oh, yes, it is! Here it is! I told you I wasn't lying. There we go. Okay. So this was the other thing I wanted to show you. At a later part in this game, this becomes an important sort of place where Lincoln makes a statement about something. But this is sort of one of the last features that I wanted to show off before we wrap with our gameplay. Let's take 5 minutes and just find 2 or 3 people nearby and just sort of talk through some of these questions and think. I think especially it might be interesting, like how should we judge mass media objects like Mafia III that engage with race? Like how do we sort of comport ourselves to them and evaluate them and what they're trying to do? So maybe just like with a small group of people nearby, 5 minutes chat, and then we'll sort of just do a wrap up together.
I wasn't noticing the dynamics of what I'm thinking about that frame narration too.
Definitely
Yeah.
get out of the car, like, or at least to me, communicating there being a lot of racial tensions, and if
And
as
the
I was
other thing
saying,
that I
there's going to
think
be like a protest of like no
different
racial
than like
mixing,
a
like
Grand
if he's the
Theft
product
Auto,
of
where
it,
like the cops are. What do you guys talk about? Which of these questions were like productive for you, and what did this game get you thinking about, if anything? Anyone feel free to start. There was a lot of good conversations that I heard.
I thought
Alyssa.
I thought Boomer asked a good question of me, which we were talking about this question of how should we judge mass media objects. And I started to answer it, and he said, well, what can we expect from them?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what can you expect from the game? And I was thinking, if this is the only interaction that, like, a group of white teenage boys have with the question of race, it seems like, from what we saw tonight, it's pretty limited. But then when I was talking with you, and you were saying there's a lot of these other story elements that bring in a more rich conception of race. From this, it seems like, I mean, I was just surprised that, like, the character gets to run around without being frisked.
Yeah.
Frisked. I can't say that word right now. Like, every 5 minutes, you know what I mean? So it seemed like race was less present than I thought it would be for me.
And just to clue everyone else in, there's a bunch of cinematics where race becomes, like, so Sammy, when, you know, Sammy's still in the picture, Lincoln, they're having lots of discussions about what it means to be a black person or to be considered black in this society, and what, like, they steal a bunch of money, and, like, this money is not just like money, this is freedom, right? This is we've always had someone standing over us, telling us what to do, where we're supposed to go. This buys us some sort of freedom. So it engages it with, like, that, and then there's other much more extreme situations where later in the game there is a sort of respectable Southern gentleman who is part of the quote-unquote Southern Union, and Lincoln goes, they're basically like the Klan, right? And they are, in this game, functionally the Klan. And they come after Lincoln, and Lincoln kills him and then burns him on a cross. So, like, it gets, like, it like, flips that, right? It's like the black man burning a white man on a cross. It, like, really goes for it in big ways. The question of, like, how effective of a critique that is, or, like, what that's doing with racial dynamics, if that's, like, subversive or preserving some sort of structure, is another question.
We talked a little bit about that insofar as the gameplay itself is peculiar in the sense that, on one hand, you're the black protagonist, and you seem relatively invulnerable. It's true you can get shot, but driving a car, you don't have to worry about getting pulled over for driving while black, unless you've already run over someone or in the car or whatever. But otherwise, the gameplay seems all about you're fighting other ethnicities and races the whole time. Racial difference is all about violence, period, right? Yeah. And so the whole game is sort of predicated on a notion of racial difference as potential race war or something. Is that accurate?
I think it's telling, right, that there are a number of rival gangs.
They're all different ethnicities, aren't they?
Right. And that the part of what's sort of the kind of goal here is to kind of, you know, gain turf. Right. But the sort of top Sal Marcano is white, running the whole thing. So to a certain degree, I think at the level of depicting those particular conflicts, it tries to touch that on interesting ways. But nonetheless, I think you're right that, you know, the turf and all of that is very much representing race as a kind of, this is a thing that divides, and this is a sort of power struggle.
Yeah.
I mean, me coming sort of from film rather than from game studies, I just threw up my arms on some level when we started discussing, because I wasn't quite sure what to look for when looking for the representation of race in a game like this, because sort of coming from film studies, you look at sort of how, say, racism or representation of race are baked into the formal representation, camera movements, lighting, sound editing, and so forth. And how thereby a certain kind of, say, asymmetry of racial relationships is sort of kind of embedded in the formal apparatus of filmmaking. And of course, sort of in a game where I guess well, if you do everything right, your protagonist is always in charge of things.
That's true.
He's never at the bottom end of things. So in a way, you feel like you have that kind of agency that typically sort of race or racism baked into formal representation subtracts from your agency. So feeling I'm the agent makes me ultimately overlook sort of forms of race that might be even there sort of representationally. So I said it naively, I wouldn't know what to look for except for narrative constellations. I wouldn't look for visualization, or would I look for sound design or something like that. It's more like the narrative situations that that you start to run into that would, and I didn't see enough of those in order to come to something. But I find it interesting that sort of I as a sort of viewer of this wasn't sure what to actually look for when trying to ask those kind of questions.
Joe, did you want to respond?
I wanted to add on that. I thought your critique was very spot on. It's basically been a huge problem in games, is how do you tell a story through gameplay. I think at this point, there's a very popular term called ludonarrative dissonance, where basically you have a game that says, oh, it's story time, and they tell a story, and now it's game time, and the gameplay is completely different from what it's trying to say in the story. And definitely, I think you're absolutely right that games, they think that, a lot of games think that just the narrative is sufficient to tell a story or an experience, and then just sort of do their own thing, and just creates this really, you don't really know what to look for, you know, and it doesn't really express the powerlessness of racism in '68 if you can just be a Superman and shoot everybody and run over everybody.
Yeah.
It's more of like yeah.
As a follow-up, I think I almost kind of agree with you on this, but I do think that the sort of blue sphere that appears around your
What
view,
is that actually about?
that's actually whenever a policeman sees you. So whenever that, do you remember when we fought the people in the early, there was a little white sphere that appeared when when the people were attacking me, or when we were trying to kill people, those white spheres would appear. And that's when you intrude on like enemy turf. But no matter where you are or what you're doing, that blue sphere will appear if a cop sees you. You could just be walking down the street, you could be driving, you could be killing someone. All of those will draw that blue sphere attention. And that's one formal quality that I think, though it's not inhibiting your agency in a certain kind of sense, it's a reminder that there's always someone that's watching you.
Well, and I think that there's a number of different levels to that, right? So one of the things that we're kind of talking about here in terms of being able to do whatever, the fact, we can sort of have a conversation over here about the fact you can run absolutely anywhere, and that's not an offense that a cop will catch you for, because if you had to hold that stick so gently through those areas that were so densely populated with cops, that would not be a very fun game to play. And thinking about all those tiny things, the possibility of being stopped and frisked at any point in time, based on what neighborhood you're in, all of that takes away from that sort of expansive, the thing that GTA and Mafia helped to build in terms of that crime-oriented game. So the developers don't want to do that level of realism, right? Because that's not going to sell tickets. And the fact that even with everything that they did, they're still in a situation where they have to lay off a number of people means that that's the kind of thing that has to be on the table. This is all things that we're considering with respect to the sort of mass media element of this. And I think that the blue circle is a part of that, because the whole point of knowing that the cop's there is because you don't want to steal a car right in front of a cop being in there. So it kind of serves that function to help you, do some of the work of surveillance that is necessary for someone with that disposition. But at the same time, it's an interesting formal quality at the level of racial interiority, because for people of color, and I can speak to experience, noticing a cop nearby is something that you do. It is something that you internalize. It is something that happens within those particular spaces. And to have the game say, hey, you're not on enemy turf, but there is this thing here that you want to keep your eye on. Now, going the next level and turning that to what some might call a procedural rhetoric, where that sort of threat comes, and maybe you haven't done something wrong, but it decides, you know what, I need to see your ID. Also, I'm going to check to see that, you have license and registration for this car. Oh, you stole it way back where? Well, we're going to have to investigate on this. And that becoming a moment where you have to figure out what it is that you want to do or how it is that you want to navigate those spaces would add a layer of realism to the game, maybe make it more fun, maybe not, but it's all these sort of risks and choices that the designers have to make at the level of how it is that you're moving through those spaces and whether or not it's going to, make critics happy.
Right. Right.
But thinking about that, the typical demographic that might be playing this game, maybe not so much.
Right. To Alyssa's point. Yeah, Joe.
Actually, I wanted to add on that because you mentioned that this game's sort of limited on audience expectations, and then so you mentioned Black Panther on the screen. I haven't seen Black Panther, or have you?
I have not.
I put that up there just because I think it's like a thing that a lot of people are talking about right now that might provide a useful model for thinking about Mafia 3 as well.
Yeah, because I'm curious. I don't know. I guess none of you have seen it, so I guess you.
I did see it.
Oh,
yes.
How does Black Panther work in issues of race into something that is very mass media, that audience have very specific tropes that they expect, and how does that compare to the way Mafia 3 works into this sort of? I've been
thinking about this so much since I saw it. Sophia and I went and saw it last weekend.
I haven't seen it, but I can speak to that.
Yeah.
the internet lets you know.
Yeah, they do. I think, I mean, obviously, like, some of the really obvious ways that Black Panther's doing is that, like, the entire cast, almost the entire cast is black. And that means not only that there's black representation, but there's black actors, like, working and, like, being the stars of that film. So that's, like, one of the big things there. But also it's, like, set in Africa and, like, is a total reimagining of what Africa could be as not a colonized space, but, like, it's actually secretly the source of all this life and culture and technology and power and all that stuff. Has anyone else seen Black Panther? Is this like...
See it tomorrow night.
Does anyone see parallels in these games? I think there's something about like powerful protagonists.
The thematics of racial politics and the sort of cultural approach to what it means to be a person of color or be black in a larger context of what Yancey would call an anti-black world or an anti-black nation. I mean, I don't know particulars, but it's very clear that the drama between Black Panther and the main villain, Killmonger, right, interesting name, there's a sort of politics there that speaks to larger discussions, both within African-American politics, but black politics globally, and also sort of colonial conditions as well.
Yeah.
So how would game studies respond to something that you just mentioned, is that sort of one notable feature about Black Panther, it's all black, almost entirely black cast. I guess you could say sort of this pretty much the same of what we've seen here, probably about, what, 90-95% of bodies that we saw were probably black. But they're, of course, not black actors, but they're probably produced by, what, white game developers?
Right.
Is that start, I mean, how do we reckon with that
so,
in that context?
Yeah, this is something I think about constantly because this is exactly the thing. I was like, okay, it's like really clear they're not like faking black actors, right? But it's like impossible to tell who's writing this code. I think that's why like journalism is so important in game studies, especially because it's so difficult to know what it takes to make a game and like who's involved in that. It requires someone to go and do that work of talking to the people. I know, for instance, so Waypoint is a gaming publication. It's Vice's gaming publication, and Austin Walker there has done interviews and like really extensive interviews with someone who is on the development team for this game. I believe he was a writer, and there's a really fantastic interview, and it's that's really great, and like it's really good when people can proactively go out there and like find out who's actually working on these games. But it also means that like you need to do that extra step in order to find out who it was behind the code, right? And I don't know if I have a solution for that, but checking out like work like that gives us a starting point for figuring out how do we think about like not just representation in the video game, but like who's got the jobs and who's actually like producing those representations.
And even with Black Panther, that's an example, like who owns Marvel,
right?
Disney.
Yeah.
So you still have that same dynamic.
Yeah,
Talking about some of the components of race, that's also just in some of the sideline like audio. So what the pedestrians are saying.
Yeah.
Racialized. So like there's a comment about people moving or checking into a hotel. It's like I think they're Jewish or something. Like that.
Yeah.
There are a lot of what was it? Haitian people moving into town or something. That where it's the pedestrians that are talking in racialized terms, which kind of points to like gatekeeping, even if it's not white versus black, it's African American versus any other
versus
minority
Haitian versus the
neighborhood. So I thought that was an interesting component of not only looking at race as a white versus black dynamic, but also how there can be elements of protecting your own or even other minorities may, it's on your radar and might raise some red flags.
Yeah.
Even within the African American community in the game.
I think that banter or the little quips that you get from pedestrians is like one of those things that like informs a sort of general experience. I know, Terrell, you've talked about what's this that sort of everydayness experience, that quotidian experience of race where it just sort of forms an environment in which you live.
I'm interested in that.
No. Yeah, it's like that. So that like one of the little things I'm not sure came through in this playthrough is that there are certain areas of town where you will walk through and like you'll pass someone and say, "Hey, how you doing?" And Lincoln says hello, and he always says hello to like darker skinned people, but white people basically never say hello to him in any nice way. And there are other places where they tell him to get out or leave, and he'll ignore them, right? So it's like little things like that where and when we talk about mechanics This is a moment where the game is doing all of that work. You're not actually doing any of that, right? The game is like saying, well, when Lincoln passes this person, he's going to say something. When he passes this person, he's not going to say something.
That's interesting, because I was wondering, I was thinking about, I don't know what the demographics are for who's buying this game, but if you're a white suburban kid playing this game, and this is your experience of racial difference, because you live in some totally homogenous place, it might give a sense that this isn't so hard being black, right? Because I feel kind of invulnerable here. But those things you're talking about would add a different texture to it. But the fundamental gameplay seems to be so empowering that the fact that you're black seems to kind of melt away. Maybe this is what Joe, is that right? You're talking about, is your name Joe?
Oh, yeah.
The ludonarrative dissonance.
Yeah.
Seems to come to the foreground.
Yeah.
There. I don't know.
It's, when we had a speaker here a couple weeks ago, Patrick Jagoda.
Yeah.
He's been maybe you were there for this discussion, I can't remember. He was talking about these games that he's designed, and we talked a little bit about this game called Spent, which was a game that is supposed to simulate poverty.
Right.
And he actually had a nuanced critique of it, where it's like, well, I just think they didn't test it enough, and if they tested it, they wouldn't have turned out differently. But the whole thing with Spent was that some people who were predisposed to think that poverty was difficult or a thing that it was really hard to deal with came away from that game thinking, oh, I could be good at poverty. I'm good at the game taught them. The game taught them oh, well, I could get good at this, and people could get better at being poor, right? So there's it shows how important it is to actually sometimes dip into that designer way of thinking and be oh, well, if you actually literally just change this one rule, or if you make this person say this kind of thing instead of this other thing, or if you actually divide it, all sorts of tiny little decisions can have a very big difference in how you come away from that experience feeling. And I think it's worth considering whether or not the quips on the street are enough to undo the powerful agent,
As far as his agent, or the staging of his agency is concerned, are there moments in the game where, no matter how empowered you might feel with your avatar somehow, that limits of his agencies are simply dictated, by something that are circumstances where you actually, if gameplay on somewhere celebrates neoliberal agency at all costs in many respects, you succeed if you just do things right and with the right kind of effort. What you want to see on some level in a game like this is that actually runs afoul, and to some degree. And I guess that cannot be as a result of your agency. It needs to be something where you run into a situation where your agency actually gets subtracted or reduced.
Right.
Not by your doing, but by something that you cannot control. And that, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. There is and hopefully scholars at Play will take this up at some point.
Yeah, definitely. A
game designer, very famous for doing a number of things. He created one of the games that's known for being the postmodern game, Hideo Kojima. And in an interview that took place, I want to say in 2003 or 2004, he has this famous quote where he basically agrees with many other sort of critics from the outside saying, video games are not art. And his justification for saying that is that, he draws on this sort of piece of artwork called the refusing chair, where if you sit in it, it looks like a regular chair, but then until you sit in it, it's this very uncomfortable experience, and you get out very quickly. And his argument is that for a video game to be art, it would have to reach that level of engagement and affect, so on and so forth. And the example would be a game where you're presented with a boss and you can't win. Right. You lose, right? But that's never going to sell, and no one wants to create that game. Now, what he didn't consider at the time is that there are a number of indie games that can tarry with that or play with that to certain effects, where it's you come into the game with that assumption that I can win, but in the background somewhere the game is actually, no, you can't win. There is no way to achieve
read about this seemingly simple game was like Sisyphus in a pot or something.
We were talking about
we basically can't win, right? It's
this is getting over it.
You can win.
But
the thing that
only with
game
much
does,
failure.
I love that game.
I can't remember what it's called, but
getting over
it with Bennett Foddy.
Oh yeah.
And the thing that game does, and I think Derek and I were playing it together, And Derek was just kind of getting used to it for a little while, and he's playing and doing some stuff. And he's like, he's just point he can't get farther. But I'd been playing for a little bit longer than him, and I was like, okay, well, I got a little used to this, and I was making some progress and some progress and some progress and some progress, and then I slip up and I fall way back to the very beginning, and that's quite possible. You can play for 4 hours and then have that 4 hours of work gone.
Because the designer basically wanted us to feel bad.
Right.
Yeah.
And he'll even say things to you like, "Oh, rough." If you need to stop, and he'll even remind you several times over and over again, if you need to put this down, go ahead and put this down for a little bit. If you're not in the right space to play this game, don't play the game. And Fadi, is a game designer, obviously, but he's also thinking about games in a very critical way. And he's very critical of things like that would lead the designers of Mafia 3 to not include all those things that would make the game not very fun to play. And he has this quote, and I think he will say it in the context of the game, because he speaks to you as things are happening. Games that just facilitate that type of agency that you're just talking about are not really games. They're not really pushing back at you at all. Games that don't push back are just software, right? They're just there. Once you're done with them, you go take them back to GameStop and get more money to get another game, right? There's that sort of disposable, consumable logic therein. But a game that can actually give you something where you actually have to play with it and deal with it and wrestle with the context of it, that starts to open up doors to something a little bit different.
Thank you so much for coming. Quick counterpoint. I think that you're absolutely right at the level of gameplay. If we want to make a gameplay...
Fadi is right, by the way.
But, okay, yeah, fair. Well, okay, so hold on. So if we want to make a strict distinction between the gameplay of Mafia 3 and the narrative of Mafia 3, which I don't, I think that actually some of the genre conventions and the stuff that's happening in those cinematic scenes are moments where Lincoln is really beaten down. So like the bad thing that happens is very bad, and lots of bad things happens to Lincoln there. And there's some trauma that happens that like he carries this sort of, I don't know how much we're watching in the background. There's some trauma that he carries from Vietnam that comes back in a couple of interesting ways. There's one moment that I encountered where he sort of like, you're walking down the step and you have these like flashbacks, and the screen kind of gets all blurry, and that leads to a cinematic. But so if It never affects your agency in moving about, but there is a sort of like narrative thing which indicates that Lincoln's not as like totally 100% in control.
Counterpoint to the counterpoint,
okay.
if I may?
Yeah, sure.
I think, and I agree with a number of folks, Eric Signal, who we've discussed earlier this evening, included, that ludonarrative dissonance is a really term. And
it's fair. It has its place, Joe.
but here's the thing, right? There's gameplay and there's story, and they may tell different things, right? Mm-hmm. Which happens, believe it or not, in more than just video games. I think there are moments where there's a story in a film that the film, is trying to say one thing, but then does various different things. But that doesn't create dissonance. Mm-hmm. You still play one game and walk away with one experience. Mm-hmm. The experience is, here's this bad thing that happens, but then here's Lincoln Clay. Mm-hmm. Who, if you control him just right, can overcome that and win all these particular things.
Absolutely.
So, they're doing different things and they're moving in different directions, but it all comes into this holistic package, which is, bad things, but then Lincoln Clay overcoming bad things.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. I think there are other games that like probably trouble that agency a little bit better.
For an excellent overview of ludonarrative dissonance, check out episode 1 of Scholars.
Shameless plug.
You guys talk about this?
Yeah. Joe and then Boomer, yeah.
Actually, I got curious about what are games that challenge players. I know DDLC, Doki Doki Literature Club, does. I think that's one of the biggest horrors is that the way you play is very simple. You click to. It's basically like reading a book. You click to go forward. Maybe you can make a one
Thanks so much
yes
for
or no answer choice. And the way the game scares you is that it starts taking away your ability, because you think it's just like a very simple game, and it starts taking away your ability to just move. It's like if you're reading a book and the book started, you couldn't flip a page, or the words were upside down. But what are some other games that sort of...
So I think the one that I had in mind, which doesn't necessarily, it doesn't hamper you like in your movement, but Wolfenstein 2, the new one that just came out very recent, last couple months, at the beginning of the game, you're this sort of broken man. Like you survived a nuclear bomb somehow. And your health is at 50 for the whole time. But you wear this suit, which gives you extra armor and keeps you upright. And that's actually only with support of that suit that you're able to move through the first half of that game. And so like that narrative thing of he's a broken man is sort of propped up and informed by this sort of quote unquote more mechanical bit. I think there's other better examples of that though, where any of these more recent survival games, there's a whole genre of games where it's like really predicated on like you have to find enough water and enough food and you have to have heat. Where instead of just giving you a space where you can move around freely, almost the entire game is having enough resources and materials and warmth and safety to be able to move around at all. And so that's another example. And then like Far Cry 2, where you like have to like save yourself. Like there's what is it there's like not malaria? Measles, but malaria. Where you have malaria and you have to constantly give yourself medicine to sort of fight off the effects of malaria, or else you like I can't exactly remember what happens to your view, like your actions, but you have decreased agency. And the malaria kicks in.
Quite become clear for me, even seeing what you showed us here, what is being played, the kind of levels of energy or exhaustion of our protagonist. He seemed to always be able to run. I mean, you mentioned at some point that he might get exhausted from running after a while, but it seems that he was either fully alive or dead, but there was nothing sort of in between. And isn't that an option to actually stage boundaries or limits to agency, sort of having exhaustion? Maybe his visibility is limited at certain points.
Right.
You know, maybe he's caught. I mean,
when you see a character's strength.
There's stamina meter.
He seems to be always on, right?
So much.
Right, or something, like the stamina or the health, if those various epithets that are thrown around, if that translated into some contingency there. I think, especially with stamina, just something like thinking about, the effect of microaggression as it processes in the body would be a great one.
Well, maybe having like 4 blue circles around him with lots of cops reduces
would make
his
him,
ability to
precisely.
Something like that. But that doesn't happen.
It doesn't. It would be a great example of, thinking about all the various theories of those sort of things.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to keep this any longer. We're well over time, but thank you so much all for coming. This was really fantastic. Hey, it's Derek here.
This is Terrell.
Thanks so much for watching Talk and Play 03. It was a fantastic event. We were really happy that so many people came out. I wanted to give some thanks here quick at the end. Thanking people, especially Sophia, Kyle, and Mickey. Sophia and Kyle graciously volunteered to do some video recording work for us, and Mickey helped us get a camera together, so that was really nice of them. We also wanted to thank again the Vanderbilt Center for Digital Humanities for hosting the whole event, also the Curb Center for Art, Enterprise, and Public Policy, and just a quick shout out to CMAP, the Comparative Media Analysis and Practice Program. A couple people from the program came out, and it was really great to have them participating. So I just want to conclude by returning to our theme for the evening. So, thinking about how Mafia 3 works through race, both visually, affectively, and mechanically, and just toss that over to Terrell and just say, like, for people who maybe just watch the whole thing, like, we've got a lot of interesting conversation, but what are some of the key takeaways for the ways that we think both our conversation got to and our gameplay got to that Mafia 3 is engaging with race?
So I think, as we were saying earlier, just a sort of culturally complex object like a video game is obviously going to touch a topic in a number of different ways. Probably the most obvious way, especially for those who are both playing but also watching, as we sort of had in the room, is the sort of visual element. And the interesting thing with Mafia 3 is that given that it can give us that particular time period of 1968 and in the American South and this sort of New Bordeaux, New Orleans situation, we can move through different areas and different spaces and see the different sort of ways in which you can visually represent racially coded neighborhoods, right? What does it mean to walk through a neighborhood in a certain side of town and see what we might think of as the sort of material conditions of that area, right? See that, okay, well, we don't see the huge, mansion sort of type buildings. We see what looks like, something that's a little run down, something that's not where the wealth is going in that side of town. And to have that represented visually, or even to have the sort of experience of kind of going on one side of town and saying, okay, this is what it looks like to be with this, and this is what it looks like to interact with, this populace, but then go to a different area and that different population, different things going on there. And it's interesting how that can so easily meld into the mechanical elements, right? So, for example, those separation between those towns, well, the mechanical element then is that, well, as we sort of talked about, I think the kind of ways in which the game encodes racial codes.
Mm-hmm.
Who is it that Lincoln Clay says hi to?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Who is it that he just, sort of says, all right, well, if you're going to be mean, I'm not going to say anything to you whatsoever. And just thinking about how a different game of a similar genre like Grand Theft Auto might encode that in, but, just sort of flip it, not really something to take advantage of, the way that a video game can say, okay, that's a thing that this genre of game uses. How do we use that to represent race in an interesting and meaningful way? And then, of course, the police officers, right? And the sort of the interface of that blue circle coming by every time a police officer passes you by. And that so interestingly melds into the sort of affective component, right? I have to say that I think it was as we were playing the game together and I started to notice, oh, wow, that blue circle, that every time that blue circle came up, it almost kind of caught me to a certain degree. It's like, oh, wow, that's a thing.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a cop there. And, to a certain degree, that sort of level of how do you get the player to then engage with the visuals and the mechanics that you've laid on the table in that affective manner, I think that starts to raise some interesting possibilities. I mean, the game has stealth elements, but then there's the sort of question of, oh, wait, here is the body set to police you at every element and every step of the way, sort of makes a very interesting argument for the game always having that level of stealth, that level of evasion of a particular authority out to look for you. And I think we wanted to touch just a little bit on a point that came up in the sort of aftermath of the conversation or following the discussion. And that was raised by Boomer Trujillo, someone who we've run into and had a lot of conversations about game studies and play. And Boomer had a number of concerns or a number of questions about the different ways in which a game like Mafia III could function for different audiences. So perhaps a way to think of it as a sort of utopian or hopeful without erasing the kind of conflict or the racial dynamics of the time is that Lincoln Clay, as a player avatar, can move through space and without experiencing the sort of psychological ramifications of constantly being monitored or constantly experiencing microaggressions as you're moving through a racial area, right? Or moving through a primarily white area. And because of that, right, maybe that's a sort of hopeful thing. Maybe playing that as a person of color who has to go through that on a day-to-day basis can be something uplifting, saying that, yeah, that's a possible way to move through these spaces, rather than the sort of thing that I think we put on the table, which was having to deal with the weight of those microaggressions as a sort of obstacle to the kind of free-range agency that we would see in a game like Grand Theft Auto or so on and so forth. I think that the possibilities and the differences going on there raises conversations about what it is that a game like Mafia 3 can do and what it is that it should do. And I think the beauty of Mafia 3 is that it puts those things on the table. Maybe it didn't do absolutely everything one can do with race in a game like that, but it does force us to think about it, and it gives designers something to chew on the next time they go in to the lab to make a game like this.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's going to do it for us. If you have some questions or thoughts lingering from the rest of the video, or you always feel free to reach out to us. Send us an email at scholarsthatplaypodcast@gmail.com. We're also both on Twitter. I'm at digital_Derek, so you can send me a message there. Terrell.
Black Socrates, baby.
Yeah. So thanks so much for watching, and we will see you later.
Be well.